This is section 13.4, and we are going to be factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c by grouping, which is the official title for what this method is. I modified it a little bit so that we're actually factoring by what's called the table method. But basically, these are the steps that we're going to take. The first thing, and this is a very, very important thing that you need to think about, is that we need to factor out in step 1 the greatest common factor if there is one other than 1. That's going to be very important because it will simplify our job later in actually being able to find the greatest common factor of the two binomial factors remaining. So then the resulting trinomial is going to be in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c, and we're going to find basically two numbers whose product is a times c. And the reason we only have to worry about finding the product of the two numbers is because the only two factors of x squared are x times x. And that product, we will need to find the two pairs of factors that gives us a sum of b, which is the middle term. And that means certain things about the sign of the two factors, because if b is positive, then we need to make sure that our two factors have signs that will make the resulting sum also be positive. If b is negative, then our two factors need to have corresponding signs that will make the sum be a negative number, and we'll talk more about that as we go through it. And then we're going to write the middle term, bx, by using the factors that we found in step 2. And then we're going to do the greatest common factor of the two pairs of factors in each row and column, as we'll see in our next example. Factors are so here's our first examples. I am first going to enlarge these examples so that we can see them better. And so we need to factor 8x squared minus 14x plus 5. Now, in order to do that, we need to look for a greatest common factor. So that's always going to be your first step. And the truth of the matter is that we know automatically that there is no greatest common factor because 8 and 14 are both even, but 5 is odd. And so we know that there are no greatest common factors to all three terms. But we always have to ask ourselves that question. So then the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to use the table to carry out steps 2 and 3. So my first factor is 8x squared. And my last term is plus 5. And the product of 8 and 5 is 40. And so what I need first is I need all the factors of 40, and there are quite a few. The first one is 1 times 40, and it's probably not going to be the right one, but we never want to leave that one out. The second one is 2 times 20. 3 doesn't divide 40, so we'll skip over 3. And the next one would be 4 times 10. 5 times 8, obviously from our original two factors, gives us 40. 6 doesn't divide 40. 7 doesn't divide 40. The next one that we would choose would be 8, and we've already used 8, so we know we have all the possible factors of the number 40. So our next step will be to look at the sign of the middle term. So you notice, first of all, our middle term is a negative number. But because we also realize that this is a positive product, that the signs of our terms have to be the same. And so in order to get a negative sum from two terms, they're going to have both negative signs. Otherwise, our product won't be positive. And so now that we know that we have negative signs, we can easily look down the row of factors and determine which one is the one that we need. Because we know here that negative 1 minus 40 is negative 41, which is not negative 14. Our second pair is negative 22, which is not negative 14. But our third set of factors does give us negative 14. And we need to look no further because only one pair of factors is going to give us that middle term. And so we know now that what goes in these other two boxes, and it doesn't matter which one goes in which box, there's going to be an x in each one of them because x times x gives us x squared. But one of them has to have negative 4x, and the other one has to have negative 10x. And at this point, all we have to do now is look for the greatest common factor across each row. And in each column. And so that's what we're going to do next. And so looking at 8x squared and negative 4x, they both have an x. Negative 4 and 8 have the common factor of 4. Then looking at our next row, negative 10 and 5 have a common factor of 5. Because these two signs are different, we don't know what the sign needs to be, so we'll wait and put the signs in at the end. But it is important that you keep the signs with these numbers in the boxes. So now we'll go to looking at the columns, and in our first column, 8 and 10 are both even, so they're both divisible by 2. And both contain an x, so x is in common to both of those. The greatest common factor between 4 and 5 is just 1, because 4 is even and 5 is odd. And so now we need to look at the signs, which we'll do by checking our products. 4 times 2 gives us 8. And x times x gives us x squared, so our first product is correct. 4x times 1 will only give us negative 4x if we make that 1 a negative 1. And now that sign works. Then 5 times 2 will give us 10x with a negative, only if the 5 is the negative factor, because 2x cannot be a negative factor. It would mess up our product that we already checked. And so negative 5 times 2 is negative 10 times x. And then negative 5 times negative 1 is positive 5. And so we know that we have found the two factors. And our two factors are 4x minus 5 and 2x minus 1. And we know that those are the two correct binomials because we've already multiplied them out to determine that this is the correct set of factors for 8x squared minus 4x minus 10x plus 5, which is the same as 8x squared minus 14x plus 5. Now, just so that you understand, it really didn't matter which factor I put in which box. So I'm going to do some erasing here. And we're going to start back over, but instead of putting the factors in the boxes where I had them before, I'm going to put them in the other boxes so that you can see that it really is going to be the same thing. So what we'll do is we'll put negative 4x in this box and negative 10x in this box, and again we'll find greatest common factors. And so the greatest common factor between 8x squared and 10x, well, 8 and 10 are both even, and so they can be divided by 2, and x appears in both of the two terms, so the common factor is x. In our second row, negative 4x and positive 5 only have one factor in common, and that's 1. We refer to that as relatively prime. 8x squared and 4x have a greatest common factor of 4x, and negative 10x and 5 have a greatest common factor of 5. And then again, we check by saying 2x times 4x is 8x squared, so our first product is correct. 2x times 5 gives negative 10x only if the 5 is negative. And then 1 times 4x in our first column gives us negative 4x only if the 1 is negative. And then our last check, which verifies that our process was correct, is that negative 1 times negative 5 is indeed positive 5. And you see that we get the exact same factors. They simply appear in the opposite place of where they did the last time. So this process always works for you to be able to find the factors. So we'll do another example now. And again, our first job is to see if there's a greatest common factor. We have the trinomial 6x squared minus 2x minus 20, and the greatest common factor is 2, because 6, -2, and -20 can all be divided by 2. And so our first job is to factor out that 2. And so that's 2 times 3x squared minus 1x minus 10. And the 2 is not part of our next step, but we can't forget it at the end. So remember that we've got it. What we need to factor now is that part. And so we begin by saying that 3x squared plus another term that combine to make -x minus 10 is the part that we need to factor. And so our product of A and C is 3 times -10, 3 times -10, sorry. And 3 times -10 equals -30. Now, the fact that our sign is negative tells us something important. It tells us that our two factors must have different signs, one positive and one negative. And so what we do is we start writing the factors of 30, and remember that the signs on our two factors ultimately are going to have to be different. So the factors of 30 are 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10. 4 doesn't divide 30. 5 times 6, and because 6 would be the next factor in our first column, then we know we're finished and we stop. And now we deal with the fact of the different signs. So when we're looking for the fact that we have to have different signs, we don't go back to the original expression. We go back to the sign of the middle term of what we're actually trying to factor. And we need to be able to get a -1. And since that is a negative number, then we know that our signs are going to have to be negative for the larger of the two factors, because the smaller factor added to the larger factor has to give a negative sum, meaning the larger factor has to be the negative number, because a smaller number minus a larger number is going to be a negative answer. And that means all of our first factors are going to be positive. Now, hopefully it's obvious that positive 1 minus 30 is -29, and that is not -1. And positive 2 minus 15 is -13, and that is not -1. Positive 3 minus 10 is -7, and that's not -1. But positive 5 and -6 equals -1. And so that's our factors. So we know that we have to have an x in both of these, because we need to have, actually, the middle term is x. And we know that the numbers that we need to go with that x are going to be positive 5 and -6. And just as before, it makes no difference which box you put which number in. Now we will do our greatest common factors. Our greatest common factor of 3x squared minus 6x is 3x. Our greatest common factor of positive 5x and -10 is 5. Our greatest common factor of 3x squared and 5x is x. Our greatest common factor of negative 6x and negative 10, since they're both negative, then the common factor is negative, and they're both divisible by 2. Now we go to the check phase. 3x times x is 3x squared. 3x times negative 2 is negative 6x. 5 times x is positive 5x only if the 5 is positive. And positive 5 times negative 2 does indeed give us negative 10. And so now we have our factors. And so the answer is, for this, the 3x squared plus x minus 10, the factors are 3x plus 5 times x minus 2. And we can't forget our 2 because that was part of the original expression. And so here is our final answer. So here again, we're going to go through all of our steps. The first one is greatest common factor, always first. But looking at 2x squared plus 9x plus 4, there are no greatest common factors. So that means that our next step is going to be to put our 2x squared in our first box and our plus 4 in the last box. And the other two boxes will consist of two factors that will add up to give us positive 9x. And those two factors are going to be two factors of 2 times 4 with an x in each one of these boxes because, of course, to get 9x, we're going to have an x in each box. So we need 2 times 4, which is 8. And 2 times 4 is positive 8, which means the signs are going to have to be the same. And the factors of 8 are 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. 3 doesn't divide it, and 4 is the only other factor, so we only have 2 pairs. And since those two are both positive, and a positive product will give us a positive sum, but this is the positive sum of positive 6, whereas this one gives us the positive 9 that we want. And so, for that reason, those are the two factors that we need. And so we're going to have a positive 1 and a positive 8. And now we'll find our greatest common factors. And so looking at 2x squared and 1x in our first row, the only thing they have in common is an x. And 4 will divide 4 and will also divide 8. And so that's the greatest common factor for the second row. For the first column, both of these have an x. And 2 will divide into 8. So the greatest common factor is 2x. And the greatest common factor between positive 1x and positive 4 is positive 1. And now we go through our check phase. X times 2x is 2x squared. X times positive 1 is 1x. 4 times 2x is positive 8x if the 4 is positive. And positive 4 times positive 1 is positive 4. And so our factors are, in any order, x plus 4 times 2x plus 1. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to pause this video, and I want you to try to factor this one on your own. And when you press play again, I will show how to actually how to actually do the problem so you can check your work. But please do pause it and try these as we go along. And if you need to, after you've worked this one, take a short break and come back to it. So coming back now, hopefully you have figured out what your answer is. The first thing you would have determined is that there is no greatest common factor. So we have to work with what we've got. So we have 8x squared and minus 3, and the product of 8 and negative 3 is negative 24. We know because it's negative that there will be different signs. And we also know that because the middle term is positive 10, in order to get a positive value out of two numbers that have different signs, then the larger one has to be the positive one. And the smaller will have to be the negative, because a small number that's negative added to a larger number that's positive will give us a positive result. So now it's time to start writing our factors. And our factors are 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. 5 doesn't work, and 6 would be the next choice, so we're finished. We'll put in our signs. And 24 minus 1 is 23, so we know that's not it. 12 minus 2 is positive 10, and so we immediately know what two factors we need to use are, because this gives us positive 10. And so we have negative 2 and positive 3. And we already know, of course, that x has to go on both of those because the sum is 10x. I'm sorry, I said positive 3. That should be 12. That's the bad thing about recordings. I don't have you here with me to tell me, Miss Flint, you made a mistake. Okay. Now that we've corrected that, we'll find our greatest common factor. And our greatest common factor for 8x squared and negative 2x is 2x. Greatest common factor for 12x and negative 3 is 3. Greatest common factor for 8x squared and 12x is 4x. And the greatest common factor between negative 3 and negative 2x is negative 1. Now we check. 2x times 4x is 8x squared. 2x times negative 1 is negative 2x. 3x times 4x is 12x if the 3 is positive. And positive 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. And so we have our factors. 2x plus 3, 4x minus 1. And that concludes our lesson on factoring by grouping or factoring by the table method using only greatest common factors. Take a break before you watch the next lecture, please.